Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Sam Glazer-Hewson with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar, a part of the Future in Focus series, the sessions on current economic conditions. Today's session's being recorded, and it will be shared with everyone who's registered and also uploaded to our website for continued access. You'll also receive a follow-up email that includes a program evaluation, ways to keep being involved, and even an opportunity to learn more about civic engagement. As questions arise today during today's talk, please submit them to the Zoom Q&A feature. I'll moderate those as they come in to be asked during the Q&A portion of today's session. Before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to briefly pause to say thank you to our Alumni Association members for powering everything we do. You'll also receive some important information in the follow-up message about becoming a member or upgrading your membership with us. I'm so excited to introduce our featured speaker for today's session, Erick Garcia Luna. Erick serves as the Regional Outreach Director for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. His responsibilities include tracking, analyzing, and reporting on several aspects of the economy of the Fed's 9th District. Erick is a co-author of the Beige Book and has published articles on inflation, business conditions, and labor. His work has been featured in local and national media, including Marketplace and Bloomberg TV. Prior to joining the Minneapolis Fed, Erick held a variety of roles in the U.S. Senate, the city of Minneapolis, and here at the University of Minnesota. His academic credentials include coursework in economics and political science from the autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico City, as well as a degree from here in economics from the University of Minnesota. Thank you, Erick, for being here today. We are so excited to receive your current economic update, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate the opportunity of being here. It's flattering that you will reach out, and I'm humbled for the invitation. I know there are a lot smarter alums that could be given this presentation, and I'm very much thankful for this opportunity. Without further delay, I believe you're able to see my screen now. If not, just let me know, please. Today, my intent is going to be just to give you a high-level picture of what's going on in the economy, both in the country and in Minnesota. And obviously, I would love to get some questions from you at the end. Happy to answer the best way I can. And before I get started, my standard disclaimer that the views that I will be expressing here today are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System for that matter. The things that I will be covering today first is the economy growing. I think we have all been hearing a lot about the resilience of the economy, and perhaps you're wondering if that continues to be the case. Where are we on inflation, and how is that affecting, or how is that relating, I should say, to the labor market? And we'll end up with a little wrap up there. Just before I get started with the numbers and the charts that I have prepared here for you, perhaps a little bit of a refresher on how the Federal Reserve System is structured for those that may want that. As a lot of you know, the Federal Reserve System is a little bit of that. It's the central bank of the United States, but it is a little bit decentralized if you want to think about it that way. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is it's hosted by Washington, D.C. It's composed by all 7 members of the board who are appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate. They serve for 14 years, and that is structured so that is so that there is an opportunity for there is no opportunity, I should say, for a particular elected official to appoint, a majority of the board members. So it helps with that independence of the Fed. The 12 Federal Reserve banks have an independent board that selects the president of the Federal Reserve banks. The ninth district of the Federal Reserve System is represented by the Minneapolis Fed, and here's the map of how the Federal Reserve is divided by districts. The ninth district covers the states of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, the state of Minnesota, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and 26 counties in northern Wisconsin. So my colleagues and I are regularly traveling across this region to try to get a better sense of what the economy is, how the economy is treating businesses and people in this particular region in Orange. As a matter of fact, right after this, I'll be leaving for a couple of roundtables in Fergus Falls and Alexandria. Again, we are regularly getting together with entrepreneurs, with business leaders, community leaders to get a sense of what is going on, because the data only tells us so much, and the data also does come with a lag. So we're trying to always understand the economy today and how people are actually experiencing it rather than solely relying on the statistics. That's not to say that statistics aren't, useful. They are definitely, but we want to make sure that we have our pulse on the economy in as much as real time as possible. In the 1970s, when the Federal Reserve Act of 1979, I believe, was passed, and the Fed was given two specific goals, two things that the Fed should always keep an eye on. The first one, price stability. In other words, making sure that inflation doesn't get out of whack, and maximum employment. In other words, that everyone that is able and willing to participate in the economy, that wants a job, is able to be fully employed. So those two um, sides of a seesaw, as our president Neil Kashkari likes to define it, are always, the Fed is always looking to balance those two items. And therefore, that's why today we're going to talk a little bit about economic growth. Then we're going to see how that price stability component of the dual mandate is behaving. And then we'll end with employment to see how those two may be interacting with one another today. In terms of economic activity, I started my talk today by saying that, the economy has been resilient, and that continues to be the case. That has continued to be the case, I should say. Um, right after the pandemic, the economy declined. GDP in Q1 and Q2 dropped significantly, but the recovery was almost immediate. And that resilience has continued until very recently. The last quarter of GDP, the chart that you have here, right here, it shows somewhere above 1%, 1.2% or so. That number has actually been revised to 0.7%. So it dropped a little bit. In terms of what is moving that growth at the national level, the consumption, personal consumption, and investment were still, even in the revised numbers, the ones that were pushing GDP positively. So again, as you can see in this picture, consumption has been a significant driver of economic growth over the last few years. Up until very recently, it continues to be that way, according to the latest numbers that we have, which are from back in Q4 of 2025. If you're wondering what that looks like in Minnesota, we only have one quarter prior to that. We up to one quarter prior to the previous chart. That is 2025 of Q3. And there's no denying that Minnesota has been also growing at a pretty decent pace. In 2024, third quarter of 2024, it even outpaced the growth of um, the, the rate growth, I'm sorry, of the nation as a whole. But again, you can see by this chart that economic growth has been relatively solid in both the United States and Minnesota. Let me go back real quick to the previous chart because I think 2025, with all the talk that was happening around tariffs and all of that, you can see those effects here. Net exports in the light blue color bars here. You can definitely notice that at the beginning of 2025, the first quarter of 2025, that the contribution of net exports, um, that is everything the United States exports minus what it imports, contributed negatively to GDP in the first quarter of 2025. That is, perhaps because a lot of employers, a lot of producers were importing materials prior to when tariffs were expected at that point to be announced and go into effect. That reversed immediately right after. And so I just wanted to point that out because I know that many of you may be wondering what the effect of tariffs had been on economic growth. And there you have it. Somewhat of a negative contribution right at the beginning, but almost offset right away in the following quarter. Just to make sure that we understand, like, what the composition of the Minnesota economy versus the United States economy is for context. They tend to be very similar, as you can see by these shares. Real estate, makes up 14%, 13%, 14% in the United States, 13% in Minnesota. Manufacturing has a slightly larger share in Minnesota than it does in the United States. So does healthcare and social assistance, perhaps no surprise for many of you who are listening. And so those are the main difference. But as you can see, like the Minnesota economy versus the United States economy, they tend to be very similar. So there's a fair composition, a fair representation, I should say, of industries across both the national and the state economy. That's why the economy of Minnesota, tends to do relatively well as well because of the diversification of its um, industries. This data we only have again back to Q3 2025, so I know it's a little bit outdated, which is again the reason why we are always out there trying to get a better sense of what is going on in the economy today. Nevertheless, it gives you a good sense. It gives us a good sense of what may be moving the economy at a given point. Q3 2025 data shows that out of the 4.4% growth that the U.S. enjoyed, most of it was pushed positively by the information, finance, insurance, professional services sector. Durable goods, that's, manufacturing of durable goods, um, was a relatively strong contributor. On the flip side, construction was contributing negatively, albeit slightly, to economic growth. Non-durable goods similarly was contributed negatively at that time. I single out those two because the construction industry in Minnesota also was pulling GDP negatively in the same period, although it seemed to be a slightly heavier contributor. Again, the Minnesota economy and the U.S. economy seem to be moving somewhat similarly. Durable goods manufacturing, again, here, particularly in Minnesota, um, contributing positively in a very significant way. If I go back to the United States data, we look at, again, a reminder that is also a subsector that was contributing positively to economic activity in the state and in the country. A lot has been, said about inflation and heard about inflation post-pandemic. We went through through a period of very high inflation in the last few years. Some progress has been made, and this picture says it all. A reminder that the Federal Reserve wants to, would like to see inflation somewhere around the 2%, somewhere around 2%. That is the target that the Federal Reserve has established. And, here you see a picture of what the evolution of inflation, was during and post-pandemic. It declined during the pandemic. Um, some steps were taken to mitigate the decline in the economy and the expectations of the expected decline of the economy at the time, not knowing what was going to happen during COVID. And somewhere around, 2020, the beginning of 2022, mid 2022, we started hitting that high inflation hitting almost 7%, as measured by the personal consumption expenditures. In the red line, you have headline inflation. In the green line, you have core inflation. What is the difference between those two? Headline inflation includes all the items in the goods and services basket, if you want. Core inflation gets rid of more volatile items such as food and energy. That is not because they're not important, but rather because they have a tendency to, again, be more volatile. You can pay, I don't know, especially now, you can pay a certain amount of money for, let's say, gas, and tomorrow that price may go down, may go up. That's just the easiest example I can put here. But anyway, in looking at inflation, fast forward to when the Fed started, acting on the target rate, it had the effect of bringing inflation down. I think, uh, the inflation has made some significant progress since it peaked in August of 2022, in part again due to the steps that the Fed took to decelerate the economy. And still, we have it somewhere around 3%, which is still higher than the Fed would like to see it. Same goes for core inflation. So the takeaway in this for this chart is the Fed has made or the inflation has made significant progress since it uh, peaked in 2022, but it's still not where the Fed would like to see it at 2%. So what happened during COVID is, there were some significant shifts in consumption. I always talk about how during COVID, I couldn't go get a haircut, and then suddenly I had to watch some YouTube videos and learn how to do my hair, and then for that I had to buy, my pair of clippers and take care of my hair myself. So, think about those shifts in consumption and shifting the overall behaviors, in the aggregate, changing from services to goods. A lot of us could not go out to eat, could not do a lot of the things that we regularly do. So we shifted to buying more goods instead of services. On top of that, supply chain disruptions from COVID itself, were also a factor that contributed to that inflation, goods not being moved around and, materials not being available you know, to produce the goods that we were demanding. Labor shortages, I think, that's one of the things that we continue to hear over and over as we travel the district or as we met with people over Zoom. People will tell us that they couldn't find the workers that they needed in order to produce. We will see in a little bit that it took a little longer for Minnesota to recover the number of workers or the level of workers that it had prior to the pandemic. So all of that was, was affecting the supply of goods and the supply of the things that we were demanding. On top of that, there were some fiscal transfers that put more money in the economy, and therefore our ability to consume, rose while all of those challenges, including the geopolitical conflicts that erupted during the time, were all contributing to some of that inflation. So fast forward to when the 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 Fed acted and inflation started easing, some of these disruptors were already also being resolved and therefore contributing also to that decline in inflation, as well as the steps that the Federal Reserve took to to mitigate the rise in inflation. Perhaps this picture kind of illustrates a little bit of about what I was trying to say in regards of the shift from services to goods. If you take a look at the light blue bars in this chart, that's the contribution from core services to inflation, and it's traditionally the largest contributor to inflation. Remember, we are a services economy. So what happens during the pandemic? The yellow bars in this chart, which again traditionally contributed negatively to inflation, not only did they flip and started contributing positively, but also they got uh, visibly here in this chart out of proportion. Or, they were just contributing very significantly to the inflation that we experienced during that time. As inflation came down, that goods contribution to inflation also started to shrink. It started contributing negatively in 2024 actually was the first year that it contributed negatively again, as you can see um, in the chart here. And then 2025, January 2025, it started contributing positively again. So that's one thing that perhaps economists are closely paying attention to, as we continue to see how the economy behaves, and therefore policymakers make their own decisions on how to move forward in the future. Again, just to kind of put it together here, the policy rate, the Fed began raising rates in 2022. And again, you see some of the effects in cooling down inflation. And so it definitely did contribute to that easing, along with those other factors that I talked about. In terms of the labor market, the unemployment rate has been relatively, I don't know if I want to use the word healthy, but it's been, relatively, yeah, I mean, it hasn't been a huge concern, right? It has started to rise, it's been trending up since about, 2023, but it's been trending up at you know, a very modest pace, if I was to categorize it. Um, the slope gets a little bit, um, it moves a little faster on the Minnesota side here in orange, but again, from what economists can see, it's still a relatively stable unemployment rate. In terms of employment, um, that has slowed down a little bit. Employment has not grown at the pace that it was growing prior to, let's say, 2025. Here's where I was trying to tell you earlier. Think about, I forgot to mark um, my index here, but January of 2020 is our departing point here. It's actually January of 2022, I'm sorry, just because I wanted to bring it closer and see the divergence towards the end of this chart. But January of 2022 is our departing point, our 100 point right here. And the pace of at which employment has grown in the United States had been rather solid up until about 2025 when it started to flatten. In Minnesota, it again, it's been a little slower. That employment growth has taken a little longer, but it has started to accelerate in recent months. It's something that I had been very curious to see, what are some of the elements behind that. I know, for example, that the construction industry did the employment in the construction industry, which is one of the sectors that I follow for the Minneapolis Fed, it actually declined over the last couple of months. Um, there are many factors that are affecting employment growth. Um, Employers may be hesitant to hire, but also there are some demographic changes that may be at play. Just another way of showing the same data, but just showing the slowdown. It's a little more visible, and on the United States side, the Minnesota data is state data is always more volatile, period. But definitely you can see the downward trend in the change in employment. This is a 3-month annualized average of that data that we saw earlier. And definitely you can see that there is a slowdown in the pace of growth in employment. That is the number of employees that employers are adding as reported by payroll data. From that same data, again, we are a little bit, we have some older data, older than we would like. On January 2026, the healthcare sector um, drove employment growth by a significant amount. Healthcare and social services, if you put those two together, drove employment growth significantly over the year ending in January 2026, while government employment, manufacturing kind of goes in line with some of the slowdown in non-durable goods manufacturing that we saw earlier, um, moving or weighing negatively on employment growth. Similarly, in Minnesota, if you take healthcare again, as uh, if you look at healthcare, it is the largest contributor also to that year-over-year change in payroll employment ending in December of 2025. Similarly, government, although relatively speaking, is it's a slow, it's much smaller negative contribution, and wholesale trade. Although I will point out, manufacturing is contributing positively here, and so is leisure and hospitality, which is good for the state. I may have already alluded to that very briefly. I said that employment could be affected, or obviously is affected, if employers are more hesitant to hire. And we can definitely see here, this is the hiring rate published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Hiring has definitely slowed down. Again, it's a little harder to see the Minnesota trend, but the United States trend is a good reference point. Hiring has been slowing down for since about the beginning of 2022. The good news, however, is that layoffs continue to be subdued. That's a good thing. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have been hearing that we are in this low hire, low fire environment. Well, here it is. Here's the low firing part of it, and that is uh, relatively good news for both the U.S. and the Minnesota economy. As you know, there may be a little bit of hesitation from employers to add to their headcount. Nevertheless, there isn't that um, I don't know if I want to say urgency, but there isn't that need yet, or at least that is manifesting on this data that more employers are you know resorting to layoffs. Job openings have definitely come down. Many of you might remember that right after the pandemic, there was this ongoing shifting from one job to the other, and there were more opportunities. There was an opportunity that if you know a worker found a job that was similar to what they had and they were paying more, because remember we had that shortage of workers. um, there were a lot of opportunities out there somewhere between 2021, 2022. That has definitely changed, and that has continued to trend down for both the United States and the state. Now, if you were to take those job openings and the number of unemployed and take a ratio from those two pieces of data, you end up with this chart, job openings per unemployed person. As you can see in Minnesota, again, referring again to the tight labor market, there were almost 4 jobs per unemployed person at some point in 2022, a tighter labor market than nationwide. Nationwide, there were only about 2. I mean, that was still pretty high. 2 job openings per unemployed person. That has definitely changed, and perhaps the fall has been more dramatic for Minnesota. A combination of less job openings being available, and more people just perhaps holding on to their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So here we have almost a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of the job openings per unemployed person in both geographies. I started my talk making reference to the outreach that we do regularly in the district, and how we also depend on the the less formal statistics, if you want, to get a better sense of what is going on in the economy. My colleagues and I are the co-authors of the Beige Book. Those of you that follow the Fed regularly may be more familiar with what that is. It's basically a collection of anecdotes that are published on a regular basis, every 6 weeks, 8 times a year. So we're regularly, when I say regularly, we are constantly out getting data that is shared with us from some organizations, talking to entrepreneurs, et cetera, to paint this particular picture. So I thought I would show you what the latest Beige Book tells us about the national picture versus the ninth district, and this includes the region that I showed earlier, which includes Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, part of Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan. At the national level, the latest Beige Book tells us that the economy over the 6 months prior to that report, the 6 weeks, I'm sorry, prior to that report, uh, it grew moderately overall. So that means, overall from the average of all districts, the economy moved positively at a moderate speed. In terms of employment, it's categorized as generally stable. Again, yes, the unemployment rate has risen a bit, but it's still, thankfully not moving um, too high, too quick. And there's been a moderate increase in prices. The ninth district picture appears to be a little bit more subdued in terms of both, in terms of all the items, almost, a slight decline in overall economic activity versus the increase nationally, slightly downward shift in employment, and a modest increase in prices. So that's perhaps where we're doing the best. The increase in prices is slightly less here than it is nationwide, but um, comparing the other two metrics according to the Beige Book, um, is the if we're going to put it on balance, the nine district picture is slightly more subdued. Again, this is a collection of economic anecdotes, not to be taken necessarily as a representative representation of, well, what not necessarily a data-driven per se assessment of the ninth district's economy, or the national for that matter. But it actually, we've done some analysis, and I'll just leave you with the fact that it tends to follow the trends of those statistics that we saw earlier rather closely. But again, it is what it is, anecdotes and basically anecdotal evidence that we use to inform this particular report. And with that, I appreciate your time, and I'm open for questions. I hope I left you with something here.
Amazing. Thank you, Eric, for taking us through all of your content. We do have quite a few questions that have come in. So if it's okay, I'll just jump right into those. We've had a lot of questions in the chat about inflation, as you might expect. Could you maybe speak to how the Fed looks at inflation? What's the basis for a 2% target? And how can inflation, especially spikes, be reversed?
Sure. So the first part, what does the Fed look at? The personal consumption expenditures, which is the inflation metric published regularly by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is the preferred metric that the Fed uses to gauge inflation. That particular metric versus the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, has different methodology that allows for I think one of the biggest differences is it allows for substitution. What do we mean by that? If you're a consumer that buys beef, and beef goes up, and maybe you're okay eating chicken for the next, um, 2, 3 weeks, however often you make your purchases. So, it allows for that substitution, and therefore allows for it gives a better picture of what prices people are paying. Um, and we'll stop right there with the PCE. In terms of the 2% question, I believe that was the next thing you asked. The 2% question, think about um, think about it providing a stable number where inflation is not too high, not too low, and that is going to allow us as consumers, investors, producers to plan ahead. So the objective is to make sure that all of us in the economy have a good sense of what the economy is going to be, or the inflation, I'm sorry, inflation is going to be like in over the long run in the future, so that we can plan ahead. I don't have a chart of that with me, but I usually like to show these 5 year to 5 year expectations of inflation chart. And if that has a tendency to kind of circle around that 2.5%, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a good indicator that people are confident that monetary policy will do its job, if I'm being more specific. So that 2% allows consumers, allows entrepreneurs, investors to have a better sense of what to plan for. If they don't, then the economy suffers overall. And you're going to have to remind me of the last piece of the question. I'm sorry.
You are doing great. The last piece was how can inflation spikes be reversed?
Yes, so inflation spikes. In this case, as you can see, as you saw earlier in a chart from that where I put the federal funds rate, and the inflation chart, the Fed, has uh, only a few levers to control inflation if the economy is overheating and prices are going up. In other words, if we are just working and consuming a whole lot and prices go up because, of your basic supply and demand, then you have that, inflation goes up and the brakes to that acceleration, if you want to think about it that way, is the Fed acting on its policy and the tools that it has at its disposal. In this case, we saw the Fed began to increase rates that caused, somewhat of a, you know, deceleration, and it has the effect of decelerating inflation as well.
Great. Thank you for explaining that to us. It makes sense. There's only a certain number of levers that can be pulled,
Correct.
and obviously impacts all of us as those decisions
Right.
are made. Can you talk a little bit more about how unemployment numbers relate to this information? What exactly does maximum employment mean zero unemployment? Is that
Good
achievable?
question. That's a great question. So unlike the inflation part of the mandate, the price stability side of the mandate, that has a very specific number, right? That has a 2% target. Maximum employment is a little trickier, right? It doesn't have one metric, so it does not necessarily mean that if we have just going to make up a number here. Doesn't necessarily mean that if we have a 2%, just to try to compare apples to apples here. If we have a 2% unemployment, that's where the Fed would want to see it. That there isn't such a thing, and the reason is employment depends on a complexity of on a complex mix of items. Just think of demographics, right? One of the reasons, perhaps, why not perhaps, like to a degree, I just don't know to what degree, employment growth has stalled is because um, there has been a slowdown in international migration, perhaps, right? So that's influencing the availability of workers. So the availability of workers, the labor force participation rate, which is the share of individuals in the economy who are working or looking for a job, as a share of the total population 16 and older. If that number goes down, then that means you have less people actively working, less people actively involved in the labor force, so that affects your unemployment rate, which could still be lower, but it could be lower because there are less people looking for a job, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as clear, but that's why the Fed looks at a variety of metrics: employment, labor force participation, unemployment. But there isn't one number that we could point at that the Fed would like to see. Definitely not.
Got it. That makes sense. And then kind of a follow-up to this, we've seen for the last several decades that there tends to be this continual economic growth, with the exception of a couple clear recession times. Is it expected that we would continue on that type of growth, and is that actually long-term sustainable?
I mean, I think the person that asked the question and I have about the same knowledge on that, or view into the future. It will depend on a lot of factors, right? How sustainable our the economic growth is today. I will agree, though, that over the last, particularly over the last few years, I think it's surprised more than one that economic growth has been so solid. um, you know, I think even with the actions of the Fed that usually will bring about some significant, well, some slowdown on economic activity, and it remained just very strong over the last few years. Um, I don't have an answer in terms of like, will it, continue to be that way? There are obviously a lot of things happening around us that need to be factored in, but I guess we will see.
Fair enough. We can't tell the future,
We
but
can't tell the future.
good to be data informed as we move ahead. Can we move into talking a little bit about AI? Several
Sure,
questions have come in from the audience about how there's sort of an AI boom happening right now, and it seems to be that we're hearing reports of it propping up different aspects of the market. Um, what are the data points to tell whether this is true? And then as a follow-up, how do you think AI will impact hiring in the next year to 2 years?
sure, sure. So there are a lot of unknowns on AI. In terms of investment, there are only, my colleague Haley Shenander at the Minneapolis Fed wrote an excellent article on the different uh, data center projects. There are only a few that are still proposed in the region, and not necessarily, I think not all of them are active, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about, a direct effect of the AI boom in the region. It appears to be from the infrastructural standpoint rather limited in terms of its effect here, in terms of adoption, in terms of how it will affect the labor market. I will tell you that I do know that and again, this is mostly anecdotal, when I have met with entrepreneurs across the district, let's say, probably about a year and a half ago, we will ask this question, and, the use of AI was not necessarily, I don't want to say it wasn't top of mind. I think there were a lot of more questions than than actions on how they were using it. A lot were using it for, administrative tasks, but not necessarily daring to do more. About a month or so ago, I met with a group of entrepreneurs that I meet with regularly, and that definitely has changed a bit. There are more, um, you know, we don't disclose our sources just because it's a very important part of our job. But I will tell you that manufacturing, for example, a particular manufacturer has gotten very creative at using AI to fine-tune the production processes. I do see that, and again, these are my personal opinions, as I think we're going to see some shift, some impact on the labor force, but I don't know to what degree that is going to be. Um, I don't know to what degree. I guess that's the best way I can put it. While there are some that are already getting very creative at implementing it, is it going to enhance productivity, or is it going to hurt the labor market? It's a little bit, I like talking about it when I get this question and I'm giving a speech. I like to compare it to the spreadsheet. Back when accountants did everything by hand,
Mhm.
and bookkeepers used to enter everything by hand. Obviously, that particular task took a lot more workers. The work changed, the tasks changed because the spreadsheet, wow, and suddenly you have more productivity, perhaps less workers going into that field, but they moved into different fields as we continue to move through time. But it's difficult to tell. I will leave you with what I started with. There are already more ways in which people are implementing them. I think the effect, we should be watching what that does to the labor market, and how to do how to make it better,
That makes sense. We got to wait a little bit longer, maybe, to see some of the ways that that will impact different areas of the market.
right?
Um, Moving into the agriculture space, there's a question in here. What are the factors that you think went into agriculture actually having a negative impact on the Minnesota economy? Um,
Yeah,
and then kind of specifically, do you see that trend changing, with so many jobs here in the ag business sector?
sure. The response is, perhaps rather simple and rather complicated, depending on where you sit. Simple is, crop prices have been very high, and that has been, hurting um, farmers. Farmers are struggling. We're struggling also with increased costs of fertilizers and machinery. When tariffs were implemented at the beginning of 2025, we did hear from um, my colleague who follows the ag sector, and when I met with some entrepreneurs in the northern part of the district, we will hear that, the investment in agricultural equipment or repairs for that matter were a lot more costly. And again, I think that they've been suffering for a while from the dynamic in prices in crops that is definitely putting downward pressure on the ag sector. And that's why I said, I think the response is um, rather simple, but behind that, there's a lot more complexities that go with it.
Yes, that makes total sense. We're actually almost out of time for questions. I want to ask you one more that came in
Yes.
early on in the session. Could you speak to any safeguards that are in place to ensure that this data hasn't been manipulated at all for political reasons?
Yeah, good question. I think we get that question regularly. I will just say that, the people that are working, some of my colleagues yeah, at the Fed, know some of the people at BLS, some of the people at BA well, and those are people that are committed um, to their public service, just like we are, So I think that so far, I think. I don't know that I can speak to any specific safeguards. I can only speak for what I see. Um, but I feel like if we're gonna talk about the gold standard of data, the US has some of the, has the gold standard in terms of the BLS and BEA and census data and all of those offices that help us understand the economy on a regular basis. So again, they're professional people dedicated to public service.
Well, thank you for going through that with us, and we appreciate you and your public service to the
Thank you.
Minneapolis Reserve Bank and to the presentation today to the Alumni Association. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for the audience, we've just heard from Eric about many national and state trends facing and shaping our country and state. A question that many of you might have is, what's happening here in Minnesota? Maybe something like, what is our state's competitive advantage in the shifting economy? So to talk a little bit more about that and close this out today, I'm inviting the Alumni Association's Associate Vice President of Advocacy and Public Affairs, Carter Collins Hobson, has some thoughts to share with you all. Welcome, Carter.
Yes, thanks, Sam, and thanks, Eric, for the great webinar this afternoon. To Sam's question, what is the state's competitive advantage in this shifting economy? One of the answers is right in front of us, the University of Minnesota. So the university's 5 campuses, its multiple research outposts and extension county offices delivering solutions in all 87 counties is the how of the state, how we build the workforce, how we spark the innovation, and how we ensure Minnesota doesn't just keep pace, but leads. As you can see on your screen, the university is a massive economic engine driving $11.5 billion in annual economic activity. But for Minnesota taxpayers, the most important number is the return on investment. For every $1 the state invests in the university, we see a $16.75 returned to the Minnesota economy. Now you may be thinking, yeah, okay, Carter, but what does that mean for me and my life? Well, let's look at innovation. In 2024, the U of M set a new record of creating 25 new startups, adding to its 260 U of M born companies that have created jobs in our own backyards. And yes, these are startups founded on the life-changing and industry-breaking research conducted at the U of M. In healthcare, the Universal's impact is vital. The university's health-related schools and colleges support over 17,500 jobs statewide. Plus, Nearly 70% of Minnesota's healthcare professionals were trained at the U of M, from physicians and nurses to clinical researchers. And speaking of alumni, let's talk about the collective power of this maroon and gold community. 62% of U of M alumni live in Minnesota and contribute $65.9 billion to the state's economy every year. Alumni are leaders, they're entrepreneurs, and they're consumers driving Minnesota forward. So to keep this engine running, all of us have to ensure that the state continues to see the university as an important investment. We cannot take this ROI for granted. I have two small actions for you today. One is to read the university's full economic report. If you want to deep dive into the high-level stats I've shared or see specific data in a Minnesota region, you can visit the link on the screen. It's a powerful resource to understand how the U of M impacts Minnesota and the country. And the second is to become an advocate. This is the most important step. If you're interested in sharing your U of M story with lawmakers, the Alumni Association's Minnesota 201 Alumni Advocacy Network is for you. It takes less than a minute to say you're interested, and you can visit umnalumni.org/Minnesota201 to fill out the interest form. When the state invests in the University of Minnesota, it's not an investment in a school, it's an investment in the state's economic future. So let's make sure our voices are strong to keep Minnesota's competitive advantage strong. With that, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and stay tuned for an email and a follow-up message. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for joining us.